Developed and published by Nintendo for the GameCube in December of 2002, first in Japan, then in the West the following spring, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker was directed by Eiji Aonuma, the lead designer of previous Zelda games Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Production began in 2000, before the completion of Majora's Mask, and was intended to be for Nintendo's upcoming next-generation console. While experimenting with the format early on, a realistic demo clip of Link fighting Ganondorf was released to build anticipation for the GameCube's graphical capabilities, and audiences and journalists believed and hoped that this was a taste of the next entry in the Legend of Zelda series. Aonuma, however, hated this demo, claiming it felt derivative of previous Zelda games. After two of the designers drew up cartoon images of Link and a Moblin enemy, the team considered the possibilities that a new unique style could offer, and decided to pursue an interactive cartoon design with the use of cel-shaded 3D models. Aonuma was actually worried that series creator Shigeru Miyamoto would dislike this art style, and therefore kept it a secret for some time. Aonuma was partially correct, as Miyamoto and Zelda co-creator Takashi Tezuka were skeptical of some design choices. In fact, them questioning the reason for such large eyes on the characters made the team implement a sort of hint system in which Link would look at nearby significant objects. In 2001, a new clip was released featuring the updated art style, leading to divisive public opinions, and Miyamoto restricting the release of any further information until a full playable demo was ready. The producer's fears of audience reaction to the art style were slightly out of proportion, as many players in the end didn't seem overly concerned with it in either support or opposition, and even likened it favorably to the works of Disney and Studio Ghibli. While it didn't quite reach the absurd level of critical acclaim witnessed by Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64, many critics still believed that Wind Waker improved and expanded upon many of the features found in said monumental 1998 adventure, including the swordplay, camera system, and puzzle design. A direct sequel was originally planned until lackluster sales, especially in the United States, forced the project to change direction, eventually leading to the darker and more serious Twilight Princess a few years later, using Wind Waker's engine. This version of Link did go on to have more adventures in 2007's Phantom Hourglass, released on the Nintendo DS handheld system, and was even popular enough among Nintendo audiences to appear as a unique character in Super Smash Bros. Back to the subject at hand, however, let's take a good look at how Toon Link got his start as we discuss what's so great about The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Splitting away from the Hero of Time that we took control of in the Nintendo 64 entries of The Legend of Zelda, players discover themselves as a young blonde boy growing up in the middle of a vast oceanic world submerged almost entirely in water. Our protagonist lives on one of this world's many islands, where there is a tradition to clothe young men in green once they reach a certain age. After his younger sister is mistaken for another young girl named Tetra and kidnapped by a giant bird, our newest hero sets off with Tetra's band of pirates to rescue his sister. By the way, for the rest of this video, if I mention the name Link, I'm referring to Wind Waker's protagonist. And if we're talking about our player character as we knew him on Nintendo 64, he'll be referred to as the Hero of Time. The opening cutscene presents a recounting of some of the events witnessed in Ocarina of Time, but also mentions how the tale of the Hero of Time faded through the generations after he left Hyrule for the events of Majora's Mask. I didn't realize on previous playthroughs of this entry how much they did actually tie the game's unraveling lore into events of Ocarina of Time, as if to present a chronologically much later, though still directly impacted story of what happened when the Hero of Time left Hyrule. However, much of this game's story beats and overall structure pull more directly from A Link to the Past, as well as the very first Zelda game. These familiar structures can be seen in the collection of the 3 pendants before acquiring the Master Sword, as was a typical sight to behold in the Zelda formula by this point, as well as the search for 8 Triforce shards, the hero's original goal in The Legend of Zelda on the NES back in the 80s. This is the first Link, in regards to every green-garbed protagonist from the Zelda series, who actually feels like a whole character in the middle of their own story. This is the first time our hero has relationships and family members from before the player even took control of him. The only family Link had in A Link to the Past was an uncle who immediately gets himself stabbed in a sewer, and all we knew about our protagonist in Ocarina of Time was that he was friends with Saria, and Mido didn't like him. However, this time we have an actual inciting incident with Link's younger sister being kidnapped, and his kindly old grandmother wishing him a heartfelt farewell as he sets off on a hero's journey. Roughly an hour or so into the game, we learn that the bird that kidnapped Link's sister is working for the most recent incarnation of Ganon, who commands Link to be thrown out to sea, where he is rescued and assisted by the King of Red Lions, a talking boat who wishes to aid our hero in his quest. After we find a sail for our new partner and friend, we can travel in whichever direction the wind blows, and quite luckily enough, said talking boat also possesses a magical baton known as the Wind Waker. This tool allows the player to conduct magical melodies that are capable of changing the direction of wind or even time of day, as well as allowing fast travel later on, effectively filling the position of the namesake ocarina in previous Zelda titles. Even though he doesn't talk any more than the hero of time, our protagonist in Wind Waker is much more expressive, with clear emotions beyond wide eyes and a gaping mouth. You can tell when he's happy, shocked, sad, or embarrassed. In typical cartoon fashion, Link's eyes and eyebrows are visible through his hair, which allows his facial expressions to always be completely visible. These expressive eyes are also involved enough in the player's actions to follow along as the player reads through letters, and will even look in the direction of switches or other points of interest as a hint system for the player's current surroundings. During cutscenes, Wind Waker's Link is far more involved in each major event as well as the game's comical antics. By comparison, the Hero of Time from Nintendo 64 feels like a mannequin that was positioned for various camera shots, rather than the lively and performative subject of these shots. Thanks to his cartoonishly proportioned facial features, this iteration of Link is arguably the most emotionally expressive version of this franchise's protagonist we've had to this day, considering that audiences never get more than a few grunts and shouts from Link in nearly all of his appearances. With the help of this game's heavily stylized art direction, every non-playable character looks much more unique than most adventures of this time, and they don't feel as explicitly categorized into Kokiri and Hylian, or even fantasy races like Deku and Goron. While we are quickly introduced to a member of the new Rito species with starkly different features, even the regular old village people and pirates have unique and heavily characterized designs that keep them from feeling like a different texture slapped on top of the same model, as innumerable video games have done before in order to save time and maximize hardware memory. In keeping up with Zelda tradition, the Wind Waker featured some of the most impressive and comfortable swordplay to be found in an adventure game of its time. That is to say, maybe aside from games built specifically around sword-based combat, like Soul Calibur or Onimusha. Each attack, hit, and counter flows seamlessly into each other, and there are clear indicators on screen and in each enemy's behavior of when the player should parry their more powerful attacks. The player can also reasonably take on multiple smaller enemies for some more chaotic fun, but these situations don't feel overwhelming because of how easily the player can control Link. Wind Waker's swordplay is taught to the player in a little more hands-on approach than its predecessors, with an elderly expert in your village teaching you differences between various strikes and the ability to counter opponents with quick-time events that test the player's agility and focus. Compared to those monsters in Ocarina of Time that leapt in and out of the player's view whenever a fight was needed, such as Stalfos, Lizalfos, and Gerudos, the enemies in Wind Waker seem to fit as a part of their environments a bit more naturally than any of its predecessors. Sometimes skulls lying on the ground will reanimate, revealing themselves to be bubble enemies, re-deads will climb out of their coffins, and moblins will be found patrolling their encampments. If a defeated enemy drops their weapon, the player may be able to pick it up, allowing Link to wield various two-handed swords, clubs, and other weapons for a change of pace from the typical swordplay that we'll experience plenty of throughout the game, as well as an adequate challenge for rare instances during which Link can't rely on his own sword. Alongside extra hearts, rupees, and canisters of magic, plenty of monsters will now drop spoils unique to their design, which can be collected by the player and traded off to a particular NPC somewhere in the world for a reward. Some spoils can even be used as ingredients for rejuvenating potions. The dungeon structures and puzzle designs feel very much derived from Ocarina of Time, though now with more wind and water within each environment, as well as much more freedom of movement to better enjoy the combat and overall improved physics. This freedom of movement begins to take shape as the player completes the first dungeon at Dragon Roost Island, where they'll meet the flying Rito people and claim a grappling hook that will allow Link to swing across gaps, pull levers, pick up items, and interact with certain enemies, aside from the hook's usefulness in salvaging while out at sea. Shortly before the second major dungeon, the player will meet this entry's iteration of the Great Deku Tree, as well as a newly introduced race of woodland creatures known as Koroks. In order to save one of these Koroks, Makar, from the Forbidden Woods, the game presents Link with a large Deku Leaf, allowing him to glide short distances and create gusts of winds to interact with the environment and push away enemies without harming them. Two of the most important dungeons in terms of story, the Earth Temple and the Wind Temple, can be played in either order as the player prefers. Both of these dungeons feature an escort mission similar to that of Princess Ruto in Ocarina of Time. The difference, however, comes from the benefits supplied by each of Link's companions. In the Earth Temple, players will have to escort their new Rito friend, Medli, into the heart of the temple in order to awaken the power of the Master Sword. The majority of the dungeon acts as a simple escort mission, clearing rooms and carrying her between safe areas. However, not only can players float across gaps with Medli on their head, but can even switch to control Medli on her own in order to fly to spots that Link can't reach at all. Medli can also use her own golden instrument to reflect sunlight for additional puzzles based on light and darkness, borrowing this mechanic from the Spirit Temple in Ocarina of Time as well. In the Wind Temple, players will be accompanied by Makar, the violin-playing Korok, who has a hovering ability similar to Medli's flying, though can also plant seeds to give Link extra structures to sling himself towards in order to access new areas. While out on the seas, the players can engage in cannon-based combat with enemy ships as long as they have bombs as ammunition. The rise and fall of the ocean provides a more interesting battlefield than solid ground for cannon duels by keeping things unpredictable and forcing the player to move and aim a little more precisely than the simplicity of the tank-like combat would suggest. While this game may be lacking any additional complexity in the naval combat department, there is a fair amount of treasure hunting to appease the player's dreams of piracy through the charts collected in dungeons or across the game's many islands. Alongside treasure maps, the player may also find charts indicating the locations of various points of interest or important collectibles, such as where heart pieces, enemy encampments, or secret caves can be found. And by familiarizing themselves with the various landmasses strewn about Wind Waker's ocean, players can pinpoint sunken treasure to be salvaged with their grappling hook, including heart pieces and plenty of extra rupees. The player can fill in pieces of their world map by offering bait to fishmen within each sector. These talking fish will add their nearby island to the player's map, as well as dish out some critical information for players who wish to smoothly navigate this vast world and discover its many secrets. The Wind Waker was one of those early attempts at open-world gaming in the strictest sense by presenting a vast world that was freely navigable by the player, though was filled mostly with vast stretches of nothingness. The amount of exploration present and even expected of the player in much of this game forms a bit of a double-edged blade within its experience. On one hand, players who truly wanted to explore everything this world has to offer were incentivized to do so through well-designed islands, interesting mini-dungeons that far surpassed Ocarina's hole-in-the-ground discoveries in terms of short-term entertainment, and of course, plenty of rewards for your troubles beyond the fun of tracking down these treasures in the first place. On the other hand, there is so much extra padding to expand this game's length in the latter half once the player starts searching for the Triforce shards, that the developers actually apologized for its length in the Japanese version before making it a little easier and shorter for the Western release, which is still notoriously slowly paced. There are just a few too many hurdles, in my opinion, that restrict the more linear players from getting to the exciting late-game moments as quickly as they want to. There's just no way around the time spent sailing between islands, searching for maps and charts, collecting the money to have said maps interpreted, just to head back out and complete a minor challenge for your ultimate reward. Again, there is so much present in this section of the game that is interesting and fun to do, but its requirement really slows down the classic Zelda experience for the sake of a quote-unquote open world. For a personal example, sometimes I really just wish the chest that appeared after solving an island's puzzle would just have a heart piece in it, rather than a map that leads me to a randomly chosen spot in the ocean where I now have to retrieve the heart piece, or so I hope that is what's at the end of the chase. Though I have to say, as drawn out as the latter half of the game is, it does always feel like you're making progress towards something at least, whether that's filling out your map, checking off another treasure chart, or finding the fairies, merchants, and other side characters who help to expand Link's capabilities. As long as they were going to make their players look at the same environment for the majority of the game, at least Nintendo chose something that's naturally pleasant to look at, the sea and the sky, both of which have plenty of extremely diverse, interesting, and even naturally occurring color schemes, which are exacerbated by different weather conditions. The surface of the ocean may change between a foggy teal hue to a warm sunset purple without the player paying much attention to it at all. The transition from a stormy night to a clear, sunny morning is remarkably smooth and visually impressive, even considering this game's less than photorealistic artistic design. The gentle rise and fall of the sea surface gives a very lively and natural sense to an otherwise very plain stretch of blue with some occasional white sea foam. The horizon also looks great, with a smooth blend between ocean and sky that doesn't look like a solid image in the distance. The ocean is speckled with little outposts and islets that keep the scenery from being too monotonous as the player travels between major destinations. Every island in the distance also has a unique silhouette, with mysterious features that are meant to draw the player towards whatever indescribable shape catches their eye on the horizon. The wind effects in the air are pleasant and immediately noticeable, which is almost certainly due to the fact that this game's main theme is wind. The implementation of particle effects throughout the game are really where the Wind Waker's artistic choices shine. The flash of a blade on impact with an enemy or the falling sparkles as a Wizrobe casts a spell make the world seem much more lively in exchange for a bit of realism that was no longer necessary as soon as the cartoonish design was adopted, though still displays the higher degree of polish that Nintendo's primary franchises are always known for. Wind Waker's lighting engine was advanced enough to render real-time shadows, which was nothing to shake a stick at by 2003, though the unrealistic lighting itself doesn't stand out in comparison to some other visually impressive titles on the GameCube. However, the use of particle effects and contrasts between warm and cool colors were excellently utilized in this fantastical adventure to demonstrate the effects of light, shadow, time of day, weather, air quality, and many other factors in the player's perception of the world around them. The Wind Waker may be the only Zelda game with a more prominent focus on musicality than Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask, so we're going to have to spend a little extra time picking apart many of the great aspects, homages, and artistic choices in the game's music and sound effects. The Wind Waker soundtrack was written by 4 composers, including the usual Koji Kondo. Advances in sound technology on the GameCube compared to the Nintendo 64 allowed for much more realistic MIDI representations of instruments than ever before. The game's soundtrack was heavily inspired by traditional Irish music and features a much lighter and more whimsical tone than many of the Wind Waker's darker and more dramatic predecessors. Speaking of those previous entries, however, now that the Zelda franchise was so well established that even the story itself could rely on self-referential world building between games, the iconic musical pieces throughout many entries made rearranged and reorchestrated appearances in Wind Waker as well to tie many of this game's aspects to related experiences found in other Zelda games. For example, the royal family of Hyrule and any locations affiliated with them have plenty of callbacks to previous Zelda soundtracks, especially A Link to the Past on Super Nintendo. The fight with the Phantom Ganon mini-boss features little pieces of previous Ganon or Ganondorf fights from the first Legend of Zelda on NES, A Link to the Past, as well as Ocarina of Time. The Kokiri Forest theme from Ocarina of Time returns not only in Wind Waker's Forest Haven, but also as a piece of Outset Island's theme, attributing a bit of nostalgia to their upbeat and charming hometown as players set off on a new adventure that feels somewhat familiar. Nintendo's use of dynamic music in video games had come a long way even by 2002, with great use of vamping and musical flourishes to tie every occurrence in the player's adventure to the soundtrack, as if everything were naturally interconnected. The music and sound effects are blended so well that while listening to Wind Waker's songs on their own, it's odd not to hear the occasional grunt of an enemy or the string instrument stingers created by a player countering their opponent's attack. Concerning sound design in general, the vast majority of characters in this game, even random, unimportant ones, will have unique voices to match their personal style, contributing as heavily as their visual design to the ever-immersive fantasy land of Hyrule. The use of handheld instruments throughout the soundtrack, from woodblocks and bagpipes to violins and flutes, embraces the nautical idea that many of these songs would be played on a ship at sea, either in a naval setting or perhaps like the shanties sung among pirates to pass time on the open ocean. There's a lot of adventurous percussion and brass while you're sailing, although there's also a constant looping melody played on a string instrument, possibly a cello, which emulates the rise and fall of the ocean's tides within the piece itself. The short songs that the player conducts are all easily memorized and tend to stick around in your head, which is great for them being primary mechanics for both travel and puzzle solving. Then again, a vast majority of the game's soundtrack is just fun to hum along to. Retrospectively, The Wind Waker is constantly at odds with Resident Evil 4 and Metroid Prime for what most fans would consider the GameCube's greatest title, despite Nintendo's own apprehension during development towards the Zelda franchise's dramatic change from what players had experienced in the previous generation. Personally, while Ocarina of Time was obviously more influential and technically innovative, I think that The Wind Waker is a nicer, cleaner, more enjoyable package overall. I also think that The Wind Waker is a viable contender for the Zelda game that has aged the best out of all of them so far in regard to their respective hardware and contemporary competition. And I know Nintendo loves their forced scarcity marketing tactics, but I hope more people get a chance to play the very impressive ground-up remaster of Wind Waker published on the Wii U in late 2013. While the team at Nintendo was experimenting with hardware for Breath of the Wild, they found that Wind Waker in particular had a striking impression on them when transferred to high definition. The team figured it would take less than a year to fully transfer the game to the Wii U, and in fact, it was complete in 6 months. This project wasn't just a quick port either, featuring completely remodeled islands, an overhauled lighting engine, multiple quality of life improvements, and a more streamlined search for the Triforce shards in order to shave several hours of back and forth sailing out of the adventure. One more addition, the Swift Sail item, even removed many of the original release's criticisms by speeding up the player's movement between islands later in the game. As the player begins this odyssey, no matter the version played, they do have to settle in for a long adventure across vast stretches of sea. So it's a good thing the developers gave us an incredibly interesting and pleasant world to experience, as well as uniquely interactive characters and a wide array of things to do, from treasure hunting and cartography to naval combat and obstacle courses. All of this alongside the usual dungeoneering to be found in a Zelda title. With its particular focus on player choice and responsive open-world design, I believe that The Wind Waker marked a new branch in the Legend of Zelda experience, wherein the events of the game directly pertain to the actions of our hero. In every prior console release of The Legend of Zelda, it felt as though our protagonist was more of a fairy tale hero who happened to be around in time to save the world from whatever calamity was taking place. While every game in the series has had comments about fate, destiny, or whatever other title it was given, it still felt as if most of these protagonists, in A Link to the Past or Ocarina of Time for instance, fell into an accidentally heroic position within a larger scheme that had little to do with them. None of that is to say that any one of those games were worse off because of that format, but Wind Waker still felt different. It felt like the story and the adventure had a little more give and take with the player's own actions and the journey as they experienced it. I feel as if this experience continued into future Legend of Zelda titles, with Link's Curse near the beginning of Twilight Princess, and even blended with the open world structure of Breath of the Wild to guide the player through a story centered on a hero whose adventures were customized to their own experience. That is what's so great about The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we charted the watery world of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. If you want to support the channel, make sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and do whatever else the algorithm demands of us to keep up with our favorite content. Also, consider joining our gaming community on Discord or watching bonus videos on Patreon. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Resident Evil 4, on screen or in the description. And let us know your thoughts on The Wind Waker and what games you'd like to see in the future. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.